Hello and welcome to the Annie Altman Show, the podcast, Season 5. Welcome to the second episode in the Communication C series. Today, I'm here with Dr. Jeremy Sherman. He is coming in from Berkeley, California. He writes, he does all sorts of different research, origin of life, different sort of science meets, how does social and science stuff all come together. And I will put all of his information here in the bio so you can check out his work. Thank you so much for being here, Jeremy. Nice to see you on the video
Nice
chat.
to see you too. Fun to be here.
Thanks for coming on the podcast. For the backstory, I found an article that Jeremy wrote about an Achilles heel, and in dealing with my Achilles stuff, I came across this article and decided to post on Twitter about the article and said, hey, I'd love to have you on the podcast if you're interested. And here we are.
Yes, and I'm just beginning to. I just finished writing a book, and I'm going to be looking for more podcast action. So you're the first person who I have found who's ready to interview me, and I'm all for it.
I'm honored. I'd love for you to share a little bit with the podcast audience here, whoever's listening, about you. Who are you? How do you want to communicate the Jeremy Sherman essence to
right.
podcast episode?
Fun question. Yeah.
No big deal.
No, I've had a wondrously lucky life. I've gotten to be on many rides in life's amusement park, and I've also had the appetite to do that. So, grew up in a Jewish house in Chicago, relatively wealthy. Got an inheritance at a young age that troubled me. I'm giving you the short version of it all. Joined the world's largest hippie commune called The Farm, which was a spiritual community in Tennessee. Spent my early 20s there doing all sorts of manual labor with 1,400 hippies. A part of that was also doing 2.5 years in Guatemala doing water projects. We had our own kind of Peace Corps, a hippie Peace Corps down there. Came out of that and did activism for many years, environmental activism, founded a national lobbying organization in Washington that still hobbles along years later. Then went to work for green businesses like The Body Shop. I worked as their head of public affairs in England for a few years. Left that, got a master's in public policy. I'm flying through this stuff here. These were serious years of my life, and yet here we go. And then had a wonderfully rich midlife crisis. I had, by this time, a wife and 3 kids. The eldest was proving to be quite a challenge. My work as an activist was not yielding the kinds of results that I had hoped for in my dreamy or hippie days. The education in public policy was quite sobering about how you make social change. And if I was going through that program at this point, I mean, this was during a time when there was a major backlash. I mean, I'm 64, so there was a sense that, you know, I grew up in the age of where we thought we were dawning the age of Aquarius, that everybody was going to be nice and kind and generous and everything was going to work out because, you know, all the forces against that would just surrender. Well, apparently not. But so it's just kind of sobering to all of that, and had this midlife crisis. And around that time got interested in sexual infidelity because I was dealing with some of that in my marriage. We had opened it up, and I was having a whole lot of trouble with that. Got interested in evolutionary psychology as an explanation for it. And then from there got interested in what's called complexity theory. And around that time, I met the love of my life, who is a frumpy 70-year-old scientist, nerd scientist, who I've been collaborating with it for 25 years. He was at Harvard at the time, a Harvard neuroscientist, who didn't put on airs. He never pulled rank. I mean, he loved to have good conversations and to really think things through. He had some fundamental questions that were very big, of very big interest to him. One of the main ones, he had just written a book. This is about 1997. He had written a book called The Symbolic Species, which was about the coevolution of language and brains. Basically, the biggest distinction between humans and other organisms. He's a biologist and neuroscientist, and it was a book that made me cry when I read it, not because it moved me so much, but just made me feel like I just wasn't up to it. I mean, the neuroscience, the physiology, the evolutionary theory, it made me cry because I couldn't understand it. But we started jamming together, And it was right around the time he got interested in another, he was turning his attention to another very big question, fundamental question, which is there's inanimate stuff in the world and then there's living beings. And living beings try. We struggle for our existence, for example. And you can't say that about inanimate things. I mean, you can in poetry, you can say that the river is striving to get to the sea, but or that everything is basically an artifact in God's striving. That would be another answer to it, popular answer to it. But he was saying, no, we really have to explain this, and it's kind of overlooked or ignored in the sciences. You got chemistry on the one hand, in which you talk about things, you talk about phenomena, and then you've got living behavior, which is different from phenomena. And so he was trying to work out at this time, he was beginning to work out a theory for how mattering emerges from matter. That is, you've got physics and chemistry on the one side. And in physics and chemistry, you can't say that the moon pulls on the tides because it wants to achieve something, but you can't help but saying that stuff about living things. So what is that difference, and how do you explain it with no smoke and mirrors, no hidden forces, what they call homunculi, which is like a little man inside of here doing something. So it's kind of the opening to a bunch of important questions. So check this out. This is a guy who's, his first whole 10-year project at Harvard, which involved a whole lot of neuronal work, was this thing about why we've ended up with language. How did that happen? And what exactly is the difference that language makes? And then his whole second project is, how do you get from physics and chemistry to life and mind, working your way up? So he and I have been jamming on that for 25 years now, along with other research colleagues. I wrote a book that summarized his work and have done a lot of work since then on it, but it puts me in this unusual position. So this was the whole second life I've had. It's like 25 years now. That's less than half a life, but it's been just jamming on this, because think of it this way. If you talk to a psychologist, they can tell you in great detail what the consequences are for a motivation. They can say, well, if you're motivated to do this, you'll do this, and they can detail all that. But if you ask any of them what a motivation is, they can't tell you. They know it happens in a body. They know it's not magic. I mean, you can always call it magic, but they only know it by its consequences. So I'm one of the few social scientists who has a working theory. It could be full of shit, but it is a theory. That is, in the sciences, you don't know if you got it right. You just make careful guesses and you try to improve upon them. But I have an idea about what a motivation is. I have an idea about what selves are: motivation, information, communication, caring, love, addiction, all of these things that apply only in the living world. And you can't talk about that. You can't talk about your wall being addicted to something. That's not how it works. So I have a working hypothesis for what that stuff is. And I build all my theoretical work out of that. So I've written 1,000 articles for Psychology Today, and I'm working on a book right now on, it's on psychoproctology, which is the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of assholes. And it's a very rigorous book. I spend 250 pages just trying to get a more objective definition of asshole. Because the standard definition is that a butthead is someone you butt heads with. And I'm saying that won't work. We end up with a butthead on butthead battle world as a result of that. So, yeah, so my life is beautifully consumed with this stuff. I had given away a whole lot of money. You signed a vow of poverty when you joined that commune. I gave away a lot, but I have enough left that I get to live a modest living. And my day is spent reading, writing, researching. This morning I took a dog walk with my buddy, the neuroscientist. We did a dog walk and talked through some more theoretical developments in our work. I'll write all day. I basically work and play 7 days a week. I mean, it's indistinguishable to me. I spend all Sunday working on the finishing touches on this book. Then in the evening, I exercise to VR and play bass. I'm a jazz funk bass player. So that's my life. It's a very lucky life. I want to keep it going as long as I can. That was long.
That was long and that was fun. There was so much in there.
It's
Wow,
a
I
lot in there.
appreciate you being willing to go into so much and talk about personal stuff and professional stuff, and also how
I'm
you've
kind of ashamed.
navigated
Yeah.
this point now where it's play, where it's stuff that you enjoy doing and would be doing anyways, and
Yeah, for me, actually,
do it.
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Wow.
for me, there was a transition for me around that midlife crisis. And I had another one after that. I had two good ones, and I'm almost 65, at which point that's a cutoff point. You don't get to have a third midlife crisis. I only have 6 months to squeeze another one in, and I don't know if I'll be able to do it. I'm doing too well. But there was a change for me around that midlife crisis where I became some kind of shameless. I stopped being so concerned with what was wrong with me and got much more interested in what's up with humans. That's what happened. I actually, so it's rare. I was talking yesterday to a Yale neuroscience grad student who said the same thing happened to him. Mostly you don't hear that in academics. In academics, you're not supposed to take it personally. That's like bringing contamination into the lab. No, for me, this stuff is actually, I mean, I don't know what spiritual means, and I don't believe in God, but if anything is like my Talmudic study, it's this stuff. It's trying to figure out the whole ball of wax and us in it. I would say that I put no higher God above reality itself, and I pray to it by trying to understand it, knowing that I never will completely. So that's, and part of that is just being, nothing human is foreign to any of us. And we get into trouble when we pretend as though it is. That is, I would never, how dare you insult me by alluding to the possibility that I could have anything in common with that awful person. Yeah, I just don't do that anymore. My mantra going into this work is I wouldn't put it past me. Whatever any human being does, I do that too to some degree or another. So that's why I become kind of shameless about my personal story. This is just a lab. I happen to be one of the lab rats. Okay.
That quote that says, "The more experiments you make, the better." And I'm really glad you bring up shame so early in the podcast, and also with how much shame and feelings and all of this actually accepting things like the placebo effect and researcher bias and Heisenberg uncertainty principle coming out on all of the macro micro levels is going to be there in any sort of research. And the more that we avoid it, it doesn't take it away, or it doesn't change the fact that we're all still human. We're all still coming from, it's not personal, and we have these personal biases that give us more to experiment on if we choose to reframe it in that way, and can give us more perspective or more direction about, think about like the things you're talking about, like the people you met and then how that's impacted the work you've done and the things that you've researched and gotten passionate about.
Yeah. So fundamental to this work is a concept in philosophy that relates to what you were just saying. The term is fallibilism. And fallibilism is a school of thought, and I would distill it down to no matter how confident I am in a bet, I'm still more confident that it is a bet. So this is about subjectivity. That is, you can't help but bring biases to your interpretation. There is no such thing as revelation. Revelation is the concept that you get out of your own way and the world is revealed to you in its pure absolute state. So it's there in the Plato's model of the cave. You leave the cave and you're no longer deluded. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Or the Matrix, any of those movies, and it shows up a lot. It's certainly part of what goes on in any kind of revelation. So I'm a devout fallibilist. In fact, in this book I'm writing on psychoproctology, I'm basically coming down to the conclusion that these guys are fake infallibilists. That if you listen to a Trump supporter, they're talking like it's a know-it-all thing, but it's just incontrovertible. They're going to defend their position no matter what. So
you got a big rain exclamation point on what you were saying here too that just started.
Oh, what's that now?
You got a big exclamation point of the rain starting right as you were going.
Oh, sweet. Oh, there we go. At the same time, there's a line. I want to keep my mind open, but I don't want to. Yeah, I want to keep my mind open, but I don't want my brains to spill out. So there's a tension there, and I caution when I'm writing about fallibilism that it's not the same as the doctrine of foregone in conclusion. So some people will extrapolate from something like the Heisenberg Principle, which actually doesn't have any bearing at the level. It's a metaphor to talk about how that plays out. We had other words for it that were not about the quantum level before, the limits of measurement, that sort of thing, or self-reporting bias. That's where you talk about at the sociological level. But anyway, there are people who will talk like there's no knowing anything. And in general, they'll talk that way, I find, to make room for their own beliefs. Like, it's like no tag backs. I get to have my opinion and you don't get to have an opinion about it because nobody knows anything for sure. It's basically a way of saying fuck off. So
yeah, well, and it's a way of still saying I know. In my experience of doing that, it's a way of also still saying, well, I know that I don't know. And in times too, I'll still, when I'm feeling really insecure, anxious, upset, whatever about not knowing things, I'll say, well, I know that I don't know. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's enough knowing to be okay with the rest of the mystery. Like you were saying when you were talking about how you only propose theories in science. It's not the data suggests. There's never a.
That's right. We don't anybody
stone, which is both very comforting and can be. It's both freeing and restrictive at the same time, I feel like, to me and to a lot of humans I've talked to about this.
So what's the restrictive part of it? That's an interesting thing you just said.
That there's something in the darkness, in mystery, that there is an unknown, that there's a restriction, there's a boundary on knowing everything, that we have all of these tools, all of these fancy things. So I'd like to also shift or start moving us towards really getting into language and communication as a symbol and a tool, and how, so similarly to how when people point out a color, that they're, are we both pointing to the same blue? And so when we use even the word communication, what are we both talking about?
Yeah, so let's turn to communication, but not before catching one thing in what you just said. So some people, it would be possible, especially in my lucky life, to pretend like fallibilism is the best grace I've ever had in my life. I'm no longer trying to nail it down once and for all. This idea that I'm betting and I'm trying to make better bets. But it's not entirely freeing because, one way to say it is you never can tell, but you will die trying to tell. We really need to know things we can't know for sure. And playing with that tension is very interesting to me, the tension between having to know. For example, my situation, it's easy for me to play with different ideas and engage in serious play like that. But if I had a kid who was dying of cancer and I had a choice between two mutually exclusive treatments, no, that's a white knuckle ride, and I'd really want to know, and I wouldn't be able to know. There's horror and joy. There's freedom and constraint in our limitations. But ultimately, for me, I think it is the cleanest break I've ever made with being a smartass, is just to recognize that we're all guessing. And science is great for that, because you enter science, there's a good chance that you will spend your whole life barking up the wrong tree. It's a search party. You're one of the searchers among many. You're trying to follow the scent of what's true, but chances are decent that you'll be one of the contributors. It's a major contribution to be looking, but you might not be the one who found it. I decided last night I'm going to dedicate my book, the current one I'm writing, to the people who are going to figure it out better than I did in this book. I'm introducing a whole new area of research, psychoproctology. It's different from studying crime. It's different from studying psychopaths and narcissists. Asshole isn't quite the same. And there's a tendency in research for whoever initiates a question to be given privileged status in their answer. And it's a mistake. The first person to ask the question is very unlikely to come up with a decent answer. you can lock up a whole field by doing that. One of the big names in communications, Noam Chomsky, I think, has done that. He posed a great question and came up with a just lousy answer that has carried us forward for 40 years in the dark. Lovely guy, great politics, great question, but his answer, a sixth grader could have come up with what he came up with around communication. So I'm just saying that's a vocational hazard of asking a new question, and I don't want to be in that position. So
I wonder too if it's something like the person asking the question sometimes is too close to it to give an answer right away, and it's really a sweet dedication, and it makes me feel comforted to know that perspective on science as a collective and for the betterment of humanity, whatever that means, sort of a practice that's really how I see it. And that's how not experiencing that is why I left lab sciences and academic science, was that it seems so much nature, of the nature being publish or perish, and this very competitive sort of striving to go all the way back to that topic in academics, rather than saying how can we all use asking these different questions to all move forward and all come together towards some collective something. Although, as I'm saying that, I'm going to debate myself to say, where's the coexistence of all of this reflecting and all of this in the head and all of this communicating, and also a very embodied being a human, being in a practice, communicating on a podcast or with someone at the grocery store or whatever you're doing, and how all of these things somehow are all supportive of each other.
Yeah, okay, well, I heard two things there, and I want to pick up on the first one first. I've been lucky to be a gent scholar, because it can be very you need science to be competitive and cooperative. And it does a better job than a lot of disciplines for managing the tension. You need that competition in order to hustle people so that they don't rest on their laurels. And yet the whole fields of science can get quite stuck as a result. And it is human beings nonetheless. But I do admire the way it's basically, the watchwords are kind of Buddhist. There's a Buddhist line, truth waits for eyes unclouded by longing. I think of it as, to get what you want, set aside what you want long enough to see what is, and then you'll be better informed and able to get what you want. But I have been lucky to be able to play on the sidelines of the competitive publisher perish world, and I've been also lucky to find a colleague in this guy Terrence Deacon, who I've been working with these 25 years, who had enough status that he actually was able to be exploring, and also he just wasn't going to do that competitive thing. He could have been more of a showboater than he was, and he was more interested in the questions than that kind of work. As for the other thing, how to be a soul nerd. That is, I'm a nerd in some ways, and yet at the same time, I'm quite earthy and haven't lost that inclination. It's an interesting question. I work with a fair number of people who are more nerdy and more soulish. And it's interesting to watch the various versions of that. But I feel like I somehow lucked in, and I really do think it's luck, into a heart on fire. And I mean, this is another Buddhist line, and I'm not Buddhist, but I like a couple, I'll pick up lines wherever. Though my heart is on fire, my eyes are cold as ashes. There's something about that tension that interests me. I'm a pretty fiery guy, I would guess. I mean, that's my sense of it. And at the same time, I love to step back from what I want and look at what is as plainly as possible. And this is a real issue in my field. There's a whole lot of, I work with a bunch of researchers who, from my perspective, are looking. So the way I'd frame it up is that there's a fundamental tension between the likely story, which we pursue. We want to figure out what's really true, and the likable story. And how you manage those two is really interesting. It's like my inner scientist and my inner spin doctor, there's a joke, there's a line of jokes among the Jews where the grandmother says, someone tells her the news and she says, yes, but is it good for the Jews? And as if everything, you're always filtering everything through, is it good for us? So I tease about that among colleagues. My interest is in maximizing the likability of the likely story. As you come up with you try to get as close as you can to a neutral understanding of what's going on, with setting aside the normativity, is it good, is it bad, and then try to figure out how to maximize the likability of that. But I do see a fair amount of research that, from my perspective, is trying to maximize the likeliness of their liked story. That is, they start with the story they hope is true, and they tack weld on enough scientific evidence to make it sound like it is true. So that's an important distinction, and it's got to do with this, how you manage your soul plus your nerdiness. And none of this has gotten into communication yet. We haven't even begun to talk about our topic.
We haven't. We're warming up still. It's
We're still
also my head
Yeah.
is at, frankly, how much it's hilarious. It's very interesting to me, and it's also hilarious that the field of study that you are proposing and asking the question of, posing the question of, to start all of the other questions that will branch off to that, is also, in a sense, in a very academic and kind way, asking academic communities to reflect on their own inner asshole, their own need to be right, their own know-it-allness, their own, and who knows where your intentions are with it, and what I'm projecting of my things that I feel like academics as a community and humans and myself are all learning, of taking ownership and accountability for that, and also releasing, for the yoga teachering of it, the shame, the things that don't serve you about your inherent humanness, being a human with an asshole, being a human who has asshole thoughts sometimes, being a human who, like the David Foster Wallace "this is water" speech, can only be centered on themselves. And in posing the question you're posing, both for people to study academically, part of why I felt so interested to reach out is the overlaps in the type of work and art and projects and stuff that I like to do, of posing similar questions to say, hey, I want to talk about this philosophy, and also talking about this philosophy by necessity means talking about each individual human and their individual human experience, and these parts of it that we have kept mysterious, and we have said we're not allowed to even ask questions about that. How dare we explore things of the asshole, even though we know evolutionarily development of bodies biologically, or we could go into all sorts of things about human sexual evolution and human sexuality related to assholes. We could go into like food and digestive and gut brain, and yet people don't want to go into, hey, everybody poops, everyone's an asshole sometimes. Everyone wants to believe that they know everything. We all are insecure and aware that we're going to die, and we don't want to talk about that. Like, that keeps coming up in my head with all of these talks, is how much this is also related to all of the other topics that both biologically, so sex and death and birth and all of these things, and also socially, things like money, time, healthcare, being attached to jobs that we're not communicating on, to get us a little bit closer to communication. So in order to kind of like go into it, the idea I'm having, or do you want to respond to that first? And then I'll
I do actually, and it's a good segue to communication. So I mentioned that this research colleague, Terry, he wrote a book called The Symbolic Species. And at first I didn't know what he meant by, because symbol can mean lots of things. But he's actually referring to something in semiotics. So semiotics is a study of how significance happens. And you can get it, you can do it where you're doing it where you say, this is this kind of a sign, and that's that kind of sign. But it's basically trying to understand how significance happens, how something can be about something for me, given my interest, that kind of thing. And there are three basic kinds of signs. There's icons, indexes, and symbols. And we are a uniquely symbolic species. So I'll just run down them really quick, because we're getting into communication. And when we're talking about how significance happens, yeah, if it's raining, that's not someone sending a message to me, but it's still, I find it to be significant of something like taking my umbrella. But it also applies to all this communication. So organisms in general, not including all organisms interact by means of icons and indexes, but not symbols. We are the symbolic species. So let me just explain. An icon is an inability to distinguish between one thing and another. So camouflage is significant of its surrounding because I fail to distinguish between them. And if I blink right now and look at the screen again, the Annie I see after blinking is iconic to me of the Annie I saw before blinking. That is, you have attributes in common, and I fail to distinguish. You know, someone could have switched you up for your identical twin sister. That's iconicity. And it can get way more fancy than that. That is, we can have deliberate icons, like the trash can on your computer is metaphorically an icon. So that's iconics. It's similarity. It's resemblance. Something can be iconic of something else. Indexicality is like index fingers, this thing pointing to that thing. An animal's call can point to something by an association. A symbol is different. So yeah, all a thermometer is indexical. It points, it's a correlation in time and space. Because these two things happen simultaneously, you learn to associate with them with each other. Symbols are different from all of that. Symbols is you end up with a type of symbol, like a language, let's say, and you have tokens within that type, like words. And they're held together by what you could call social convention that has to be passed on to every individual. And it opens a vast world to us because there's nothing we can't name. And our naming of things can be very fuzzy or very specific. I have two grandkids, and one just came through, one's 3 years old, just came through a whole lot of finger pointing. That is where you learn how to indexically associate words with things. And at some point that achieves a liftoff. So if I said to you out of the blue, soft, you wouldn't know what I'm referring to. If I said soft while pointing at your carpet, you would know what I'm referring to. But then in a completely different room, I can say to you, your carpet is soft, and you'd totally get it. At that point, I no longer need to be physically associated with the things around me. Animals can't do this, we can, and we go hog wild with it. It's a radical difference between humans and other organisms, is that we basically live in two worlds, because all of these words interconnected, pointing to each other in our minds, enable us to create whole visions of the past, of the future, of the real, of the imaginary, and it is a clusterfuck. We are overwhelmed. We are trudging through a sandstorm of possibilities made possible by language, and we can escape it through language too. That is, I can become a smartass who claims to have had a revelation that gives me a way to claim that I know exactly what matters and doesn't matter in the real world because I got a revelation from some magical God. It's not, or from whatever source. There are so many ways that language traps us with too many possibilities and frees us to escape any possibilities we don't like. And then communication among ourselves gets really complicated because of all that. So
I love that you said the word clusterfuck. That's one of my favorite word symbols.
That's
and
true.
Again, we're back on this point from before that you asked me to elaborate on and then brought up again, and we're still circling in a cool way of what is both restricting and freeing about language. And also thinking about in words of how both science and spirituality have relied so much on language, of both using operational definitions and words to write about, and how academics have progressed, and art and different things with words, and also this very religious and God said, let there be, and speaking things into existence and manifestation, and generally how much weight is given to words, which are a construct and a fun game. And so again, I'm really glad you brought up clusterfuck.
Yeah, though I'm beginning to sense an inclination in your responses that I want to just flag. It's a difference between us, perhaps. I don't see escaping this stuff. I see words as a problem across the board. I see us all as humans and all dealing with this, no matter what disciplines we choose. I'm more interested in that, and I guess I want to make sure to avoid something I'll call. There's two things. I have two names.
May I pause on the first? Can we go into the first?
Go ahead. Yeah, you go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm curious about what I said or how I said it about escaping words, especially with all the meta levels of this. We're here in a podcast in a word format and in a
that's right on. Yes.
Platform I am here to use words as a tool to give reverence to words, to use words to understand more things about other words and open up more questions. I'm here also to make fun of words and to say these are a silly label, and also these are so powerful and useful, and I love words. I have words tattooed on me.
Got it. No. Okay, so
I'm not spiritually bypassing the existence of words. I'm not intentionally, anyways. I'm committed to the podcast and words here.
No, right on. Of course. Yes, I barely know ye, and you barely know me, and that was probably me jumping to a surmisal that I flagging something that that's probably unnecessary to flag at this point. But this is part of. I thought this was part of. This would be an interesting contribution to the engagement. Let me talk briefly about a couple of things that I see people do sometimes with words. I'll call it exempt by contempt. One of them, which is if I see someone using words in a way that I think is escapist, I'll do this. I often do this. I will enjoy my disdain for what they do as evidence that I don't do it too. If I find, I spend a lot of time with the folly in academics. There's a lot, because a lot of the research questions that I'm addressing have answers in the sciences. I just slagged off the most revered Noam Chomsky. I just said his answers had been developed by a sixth grader to his great questions. When I'm doing that, I'm enjoying some satisfaction at not being him, not being that guy. So that's exempt by contempt, and at the extreme, you get something like Fox News, which is just doing this full time. That is, all they do is they show disdain for others, and in the process, self-glorify. It's like righteous indignation, but it's indignation-fueled self-righteousness is what it is. And any of us can do this anytime. And we have to watch it, because whatever they're wearing, I'm wearing too. Like I said earlier, I wouldn't put it past me to do that sort of stuff. That is what humans do. And I don't want to turn that then into a reason to be cynical or fatalistic about it. We're all trying to one degree or another to get it right. And we're working with words which are not building blocks. They topple really easily, or you put in one lousy foundational assumption and you're off to the races. That's why any of us could end up barking up the wrong tree for a whole life. So all of that's interesting and related. And one more term I employ this way is defaulty logic. Since they're so wrong, I must be right by default. Also, very popular move. These are things we can do with language probably more than with other organisms. Probably can't do them as well. It's a version of Schadenfreude, a sense of satisfaction. And then we could talk some about the difference between how spirituality and academics use words. That's an interesting question. But anyway, you take it where you want to go next. All right.
Okay, I was definitely hearing a lot of Jungian philosophy in that too, and also in the research and the things you're doing with psychoproctology, of the things that annoy us, upset us, bring up a reaction in us.
Yes.
That we're seeing in other people are things within ourselves, and also that human tendency to say, well, I'm not that, I'm different from that. oh, let me point to almost using another human as a symbol and calling them an asshole to say, oh, well, I'm not the asshole, instead of
Right.
us all being assholes.
Yes.
I'd like to shift into,
Please.
make a little podcast game of this. I'd like to give a couple different words that have been floating in my head here, and I would love for you to define them in 60 seconds or less from your one human perspective of using words to give your Jeremy Dictionary definition of that word. I feel like I need to kind of shake it off.
I don't know if I can hit it with the 60 seconds, but I'll see what I can do.
Okay, you can go to 100 seconds if you need.
Oh, there we go. We're Twitter feeding. All right, good.
Okay, so the first word I'd like to start with is the word symbol. So to kind of go more on the surface level, and I'm really glad you shared all of the more details of indexing, and that's very interesting and very relevant. To go more just pure surface of the word symbol. When you use that word, what words do you mean to describe that word?
It's a sign vehicle that is maintained culturally by social convention. And it doesn't look like the thing it represents, and it doesn't point to the thing it represents in its physical form. It is an arbitrary sign in that respect.
Ooh, okay. I like this game already. And also you brought up it being so socially connected.
Yeah, words. A word in English means nothing in Chinese, that kind of thing. It's got to be sustained culturally, and it's morphing while it gets sustained. I mean, the evolution of words is fascinating to me. I spent a lot of time with etymology.
And you would say words are one type of symbol.
Right. Musical notation would be another kind. Mathematical symbols as well. And then I should also be clear about this, about symbols, about signs in general. Some people do a taxonomy of it where they'll say, well, this thing right here is an icon and that's an index. Let me give you a brief example to show you how that doesn't work. A wedding ring. A wedding ring is iconic of a marriage because it's a closed circle, okay? It's like a chorale, and it's also never ending. It's indexical of a marriage because it will corresponded in time and place to a vow you made. That is, you made a vow and put on the ring. It's indexical. And it's symbolic in that within certain cultures, a ring on that finger represents marriage. So so you get the sense of how it works there. Language is the most vast of our systems of symbols. And by the way, it gets way more complicated than what I just described, but that's a great approximation. And the guy who came up with this is a guy named Charles Sanders Peirce, who was an American philosopher, kind of a wild man, turn of the last century. And he founded two fields. One is semiotics, and the other is pragmatism, which is a branch of philosophy where you'd get fallibilism. So he's the founder of pragmatic philosophy. Henry James was one of his students. Dewey was one of his students. Wonderful guy. I hear he was a bit of a cantankerous lout, but he was quite brilliant for what he did. And you could say I'm in that legacy. We're building out from some theories he came up with. So that's symbols.
I'm glad you brought up too the overlap there, sort of like the love languages overlapping often, where one thing can be a symbol of multiple love languages at once, or it's not always so cut and dry that it just falls into one category.
Fair enough, and that's also where it becomes where you get polysemy, which is that one symbol can mean lots of different things to lots of different people. That's the Tower of Babel effect, and it's huge, especially because we want them to mean different things. You know,
we're going to get into that. We're going to circle back there with assholes and humans, because we're all assholes. It's my favorite insult because it is so equal. The next word to go into is communication. So what words would you use to describe the word communication?
Oh, geez. Yeah, it's a hard one because it's in a way. So, I mean, it's not hard because it's controversial or anything.
You can use the word symbol in it.
No, communication isn't just symbols. Pheromones are our indexes. And anyway.
I mean, you can
Yeah,
use
it's not
word
like
symbols as part of it, if that's helpful, or
yeah,
if
no,
that's
yeah.
how you define
I
it.
think the only problem with it is I don't have anything much deep to add to communication. That is, I don't have anything innovative to say about it. All I'm saying about communication is what we think it is. That is, it's interaction between selves and also imaginary selves. Let me add that in. That is, we communicate with other selves, but we also communicate sometimes therapeutically. I think of gods, dogs, and blogs as forms of therapeutic communication with things that are probably not listening the way we think they are. That is, whether God is listening or not doesn't matter to the therapeutic benefit of praying to him. Whether my dog understands me when I say all these things to him doesn't really matter to the therapeutic benefit of it. And whether I have readers for my blog doesn't really matter to whether the therapeutic benefit I get out of it. It's I like what one guy, Quentin Quist, said about books. He said, books are for writing, not for reading. I don't believe it. I read a lot of books, but I love it because it's actually mostly true. I mean, I'm mostly writing these days. So it's a kind of communication, so it can be to real or virtual audiences, but the audiences are always selves. I don't communicate to my computer. My computer is not a self.
So I heard the word interaction.
Well, yes, but you can also communicate in one direction and not have interaction. But it is a kind of, you could say that it's a intersubjective responsiveness, where we're trying to, intersubjective, you know that concept? It's basically, yeah, so intersubjective, and I don't mean anything mystical by it. Like, you know, this is the argument that that money is a intersubjective concept. We all believe it's got value because of the intersubjectivity. So, yeah, I guess I've confused myself in a good way by asking this question about the therapeutic benefit of communicating when no one's listening.
Well, that gets into communication as potentially expression. How do you feel about the word expression as a word related to the word communication?
Yeah, so yeah, and this is the interesting thing.
And this is great to be doing in a meta sense on a podcast where right now it's the two of us just recording. We're not ever going to know when someone listens to this and their impact on
that's
it.
Right, that's right.
So I
pay some attention to page views and audience. I definitely feel some uplift when I have a big hit, and I don't feel much downfall when I don't, because I mean, often in my case, I'll write an article that I think was great that gets fewer hits than an article that I think was more trivial, you know, and occasionally I will write one to throw this dog a bone that is a pop one. I'll write one that I think will get a lot of hits. I don't tend to do that much, but so normally I get 25,000 page views a week on my Psych Today articles. This week I'm down to 14,000. I don't notice a drop in my inspiritedness. So there is something about, and when I started out, perhaps this is your experience too with podcasts, I had almost no audience. I cultivated what I called strategic gullibility. I pretended I had an audience that really cared, and it was very useful for me. There's also internal communication, very interesting to me too. That is talking to oneself.
Yes, and our own mind-body communication is, both from the spiritual and scientific perspective, something that I feel very passionately about.
Good. Let me ask you a question then.
Okay.
It's your turn. I want you to define spiritual for me.
Ooh, yes. To me, spiritual, that's a great one, is the word spirit. I'm very literal with word definitions. And so spirit is something that I'm not seeing, touching, that my 5 of the basic senses are not the ones experiencing. Maybe, you know, other senses like proprioception, or if you want to get into the different clair audience
Proprioception
sentience,
would still be.
To me, there is a spiritual element of, okay, so I'm a big mind-body nerd, and to me there is, spirit is the word, or soul, and I understand why people don't like those words or don't believe in souls. To me, there is a third point on the triangle of where mind and body connect, where you brought up the word magic before, people could use that, and that one seems related to me. And also I use the word magic in science for how that goes as well. And maybe the word mystery is actually more applicable here than I've realized before answering this now, that to me, there is some sort of third part. There's some sort of something, some experience in the connection between two things. For the communication, in the interaction, there is an alchemization, both in a very hippy-dippy sense and in a very literal science experiment sense, where you take two things and combine them and they become a third thing that neither of those things would have become without interacting.
Good.
That was, I think, just at 60 seconds. That's how I currently define that word. I'm sure it'll change in the future.
Okay, so I have a couple of responses to that.
Okay.
And the first one is Moire Patterns. You know about Moire Patterns?
Mm-mm. It sounds familiar.
Yeah, it's worth looking up at some point. It's how you get a third thing out of two things, which is pretty fundamental to our research. So I happen to work in a campaign that says we're looking to find natural explanations for all natural phenomena. That's what I think of science as. It's a campaign to do that. Who knows if it'll work or not? But in this campaign, you don't get to pull out magic. I was thinking just this morning about how funny the term is, do you believe in magic? Magic is playing tricks on the mind using natural artifacts. That is, you're not doing anything. It's not the same as a miracle. Magic is a trick. So yes, to believe in magic is not to believe in miracles. It's to believe in the opposite of miracles. I believe that magicians are able to fool us. I believe in magic in that respect. But that's just me. But anyway.
What about, Meg, to interject there, what about placebo effect? Because that was something coming up too in this sort of.
No, that's right.
Talking about how I would define the word spirit again. That was a big part of shifting from being, from my perspective, only very science is a practical field to understand things and explain them practically, and everything has a practical explanation. And the more I have learned about and continue to learn about the placebo effect, and not to say that these other, like, they both coexist to me. There's still that practical side where you can give someone this pill and it has this effect, and also to overlook or to neglect, not to acknowledge.
Yeah.
So all sorts of experiments of people giving sugar pills or having I understand. Surgery or whatever.
Notice that you've got. I want to tease out an interesting dilemma to sleep on, because it's right where you seem to be talking. That is, I'm what I'd call intellectually bicurious. When I hear two opposite things coming out of my mouth or out of someone else's mouth, that's where the interesting thing is. So I'm going to try something out with you and what you just said.
Okay.
Placebo effect is evidence that humans are foolable. That doesn't surprise me at all, but so is hallucinating on drugs and all of these things. We see things that are not natural material objects in the world in the same way as the things we rely on. It wouldn't be, to ground it, in case anybody wanted to defend it, that those hallucinations are real. If I took ayahuasca or acid and then dreamed that I was climbing out of a window of my house onto a magical, colorful airplane, you would consider that ill-advised because that airplane is a hallucination. So we obviously can see there's a difference. So apparently with placebos, humans can be fooled. Now,
I'm going to pause there to say I agree with that definition of placebo effect, and I disagree with that as the entire definition of placebo
That's
effect.
where I wanted to tease this out, because I think that there's another part of you that wants to say there's a je ne sais quoi. There's a mysterious other sense that transcends the natural. And could it still be natural though, even if it is, quote, transcendent, or could it still be? To me right now, I see placebo as that, and I'm really glad that you're bringing this stuff up and helping me tease it apart, and whoever's listening and they're teasing it apart, and you're teasing it's a part of the part that is showing how we are fallible, and also showing how that fallibility can have physical, tangible consequences. We can then measure. There have been studies to then measure that's very clear. So make this important distinction. Santa Claus, the idea of Santa Claus is real. We know because it makes physical differences to what occurs in the world, the idea of Santa Claus. Santa Claus himself is not real, but the idea of Santa Claus is real. So apparently, and you can go further than this. You take any religion that you just find not even wrong, just profoundly pulled out someone's butt. Whatever it is, and you can be very respectful to the people, but at the same time and say, just no, that's not going to. And you watch the flocks that go to it, and you would say, well, obviously, things that are not real can have major effects on what happens in the world. So the question is whether those things that are not real have some kind of what we call ontological status. That is, there is a quality of them being that is proven by the fact that they make a difference in the world. The fact that so many people change their behavior based on the existence of the idea of Santa Claus, does that prove Santa Claus? That prove the
and that's also oh, excuse me, go ahead.
No, does that prove the existence of Santa Claus because so many people respond to the idea of Santa Claus? That's the question.
That's a really helpful example to bring up, which feels related to me and also still separate from internal one-on-one, what were the stories we're telling ourselves about our mind body and different physical healing practices, different ways that on a micro level how that happens. I do feel that's a very interesting point, and it feels like a very philosophy, like, well, what is a chair of, like, well, does Santa Claus exist if all of these things in the 3D physical realm are happening on a very reality-based consensus of how people are behaving in, quote, reality because of this thing.
Good.
So
all right.
I'd like to go now to the next definition. I would like your words about what this word means to you, which is truth. And like I was sharing, the podcast used to be called True Shit. And I used to start episodes asking people with, well, what does truth mean to you? Which is still in process.
I got a great answer to that one.
Okay, I'm ready.
I'm going to talk about it as, I'm going to combine two words, truth and reality.
Are you, hold on. Okay, I mean, your definition.
I mean, I'm just saying, I'm happy to use truth, but let me just tell you, it's a 2-for-1 here, because what I'm saying is truth and reality are going to combine. So my definition for truth and reality will be roughly the same.
Okay.
They are both the category that we call truth or reality is in a way an idealization. I don't mean that what goes in the category is ideals. What I mean is that it's the collection. We imagine a collection of all of the factors that could impinge one way or another, indirectly or directly, on us. All of the threats and opportunities are in this category. And while humans will debate till the end of time what belongs in this category, there's surprisingly little controversy about the category itself. That is, what is real is what matters to us. And what is true is what matters to us. I would say truth is what you don't want to fuck with. It's the stuff that you better take it as a given if you want to survive. And then you get into all sorts of complications about who's surviving, how long, how many, et cetera, et cetera. But that's what we mean by true or real. And like I say, we will debate endlessly what goes in that category. But if you listen to people, that's what they mean by it. They mean the category of things that have to be factored in. That is, everything significant or potentially significant combined is called truth. And that's reason, this comes back right back to the question we were just talking about a minute ago. I consider the idea of Santa Claus true. It is real in that it makes a difference to people's life. I do not think of Santa Claus as true. I do not think of him as real. And you can do this with anybody. I don't mean to pick on Santa Claus, especially this season.
Especially as two Jews on a podcast or Jewish.
I know that during the war on Christmas, here we are talking and dissing Santa Claus. But I actually wish that Jesus was held the way that Santa Claus is. He's a wonderful, role model for first approximation morality for little kids, and then you grow out of them and you have a sentimentality about them. That's how Jesus should be remembered.
Ooh.
Moses too. No, they nailed it with Santa Claus. And this does relate to what we were talking about just a minute ago. Look, I know a part of you and a part of lots of us, I would have it too. I don't think I have it so much anymore, that needs a free space on the bingo board. I need one place, some kind of wild card where I can say, yeah, there's something beyond this. It's mysterious. It's unknowable. I know this about it. It's often a little ironic how that goes. You know, the unknowable God, which I can now tell you all these details about, is a little ironic. But it's this thing, it's this je ne sais quoi. I feel it. I feel it's very convincing to me when I experience it. And it transcends, it's like no tag backs. No one can challenge this thing because it's from another realm. And I often have seen that used for good purposes, but I also see it used for bad ones. That is, so I have a buddy who says that he believes that there's a cosmic energy that wants us all to get along. And I say, yeah, okay, well, if you're going to buy that, what's to stop a guy from ISIS that believes that there's a cosmic energy that wants us to create jihad? I mean, if you can use it for a good cause, what's to stop someone from using it for a bad cause? And I do have an answer, which is enjoy it, savor it. It's called, like, it's optimal illusion. It's kidding ourselves where it helps. But in the meantime, from my biased perspective, I'm much more interested in, I pray to the God of reality, of nature. That is, I humbly defer to it because I know that it can fuck with me way more than any imaginary God can.
This makes me think of the Jesus fish that says Darwin inside of it, which I find so funny. And also, I often am inclined to ask those people to say, do you feel at all like this is you being religiously devoted towards science and doing the same sort of worshiping? And I'm going to bring up the David Foster Wallace speech again, is relevant again to me for the This Is Water speech, where he talks about how everyone everyone worships something. There's no getting out of it. You can worship money, you can worship science, you can worship your body and beauty, and there is. So my other point of this too is to say that even in the natural world, and part of, again, these are my current feelings, beliefs, expressions of my humanness, my communicating my being human right now, is to say also that in the natural world, if we're going to go from a very scientific perspective, there are, to go into hippie of sacred geometry things, there are certain geometrical things in nature that existed before humans and that will exist after humans that seem to show parts of structure, harmony, collaboration, all of those other peace and love related words.
Yes, okay.
That to me also can show, and a piece of this too that I get into, because a word that keeps circling around with a lot of what we're talking about is nihilism. And I definitely went through a nihilistic phase, if we're going to talk about like past phases of ours. And, you know, like maybe what you're saying is, because sort of what I was hearing was you being like, hey, Annie, I see you doing this thing that I grew out of. And so maybe I will grow out of it, or maybe I won't. Maybe you'll grow into this thing. Maybe I'll grow into some other thing. It jogged in my mind my growing into and out of a nihilistic phase into, because I went through total fuck all organized religion, fuck anything religious. When people would say the God word, I would literally shut down in conversations and like,
I get this.
Not want to hear it. And
yeah, no, it's different.
And to me, to tie this to communication and symbols, part of it has to do with what we cannot fully express with symbols, or what cannot be fully communicated, and these mysterious parts of life, which are, we don't know how we got here. We don't know where we're going after here. We can talk about it in podcast, and we can talk out our asses and psychopractology of like talking about the topics and the things, not that being talking out your asses, about talking about asses of all of these things don't change, that we don't know how we started existing, and we don't know what happens when we're not existing in these suits. And there's some level to me of that to get into and out of bed, I personally, all I can speak from, need to release some grip of saying, I'm not gonna ever fully know this. And if I want to worship reality, is that really that different from me worshiping any other thing? And how do these all coexist? I have no idea.
Got it.
I have
I
no
understand.
idea.
I
I
understand the
know that
position
they
you're
do.
describing. Yeah, I had a conversation with Michael Lerner that had a similar flavor. You know him? You probably know him, right? Michael Lerner? He's a Rabbi Michael Lerner. You know this guy?
No, I'll have to check him out.
Tikkun. He's kind of up your alley. I think you might like this guy. I won't make that reference then, though you might check out Tikkun. Anyway, this is familiar to me. I guess what I would say next is, do you have a question for me?
I was going to go into the next word definition that seems sort of related to me sharing and to yours and both of our...
But let me ask you this. Do you have any question related to what you just said? Just to follow that out for a second, is there anything you'd be interested in hearing from me relevant to that? Like how we... And speaking of communication, here's the thing. We could, if we kept on going for hours, we could probably come to some cycle where we'd both be making a claim that's not quite hitting with the other person. That is, I hear what you said, but you might actually end up feeling like I didn't quite hear it because I'm not necessarily, I don't come out of it on the same page. We could agree to disagree, whatever like that. That would be, but I think, do you know, there's a guy who's been really important to me, relevant to what you just said. I'm just going to say it because I don't think I'm going to get the question necessarily that would bring it out. There's a guy named Ernest Becker, wrote a book called The Denial of Death, which is really, has been important to my work. And very much an expression of what you just described. He makes a case that because we are a symbolic species, we are the first creatures to be able to foresee in detail our own deaths. As we can tell that we're going to die in a way that I don't think potato bugs can, and I don't even think dogs can. And that complicates our lives. If you ask me for my 100-second version of what spiritual means, for me, it is the question of how to throw all in knowing you will be thrown out. How do you throw into life? How do you care about this thing? Because the fatalism you described is not, that dog don't hunt with me. I'm not doing that. I'm not going to go nihilistic about life. And at the same time, from my perspective, from the perspective of someone who's figured out a theory about how you'd get mattering out of chemistry, how you'd ever get living beings who tried like I do out of mere chemistry. Mattering is real, but it doesn't matter to the universe. That is, my care is real, but it doesn't, the universe, it's not fundamentally or ultimately of significance. Everything's significant to me. So he's basically, so for me, the spiritual question is, how do you invest in life knowing that you're going to have to divest? And it's a really interesting question. And there are, I would say there are three basic answers. Two of them emphasize much more. One of them emphasize a lot, which is, if you look at most religions, they say, find the one true investment that you will never have to divest from and will give you eternal life. So that's where a whole lot of religion, if you think there's 1.8 billion Muslims, 2.4 billion Christians, 16 million Jews. There's not many of us left, but those two religions, the Abrahamic religions, which is where a whole lot of the world ended up, is like you find the one true way and you have faith in it, and it can, in many cases, grant you everlasting life elsewhere. Another version of it is you don't invest, you become detached. This is the whole Buddhist strand. But you also hear it in postmodernism, and you hear it in a kind of scientific nihilism, which, like you, I reject. As I'm in the business of explaining scientifically souls, and I have colleagues who want to pretend we're fucking computers, which is just ridiculous to me. Computers aren't trying to do anything. So how do you invest knowing you have to divest? My answer as a soul nerd is that's the curriculum. I'm always trying to figure out what to invest in and what to divest from. And I'll do that till the end of my days, which is a different answer than than the one that suggests that there's something unknowable that I can hold out hope will carry me forward. I'm quite convinced, given that I have an explanation for what a self is. I'm not saying it's right, but I have one. From its origins, I have a sense of what happens when a self dies. And it's got to do with the Moire pattern we were talking about a minute ago. It's about the third thing that comes together when that comes out of two things. I have an explanation for how that happens physically. It's wild. And why so my selfhood is the disappearance of that third thing and the dissipation of the other two. So anyway, I don't know if any of that's if that was very trackable, but that's my definition of spirituality, and it was more than 100 seconds.
All good on the timing. That was the question I was gonna pose to you.
You were gonna ask me spiritual?
The question that you gave to me to give back to you. So I'm glad that you
Perfect.
got into it. I'm curious when you said you didn't think you were gonna be asked it, if that was what you meant, or if there was something else that you were really.
No. I think I wanted to bring up Becker.
I'm also for the record to before you go into that, I cannot feel your feelings. I cannot experience your perspective. I'm not looking to debate. I've done that. And at this point in life, I'm not looking to debate the existence of God or spirit or what. I don't.
Right on. We don't need it. No, that's. I
don't see that as productive and useful to say, let's.
Right on. That's totally fine. I spent the last week reading Reinhold Niebuhr. This guy's a Protestant Catholic Christian. I'm digging what the guy's got to say. It's fine. So we talked a little bit about spiritual. Let's go back to communication, maybe. And also there's what.
I'd like to go into. I had a different path here. I'm really glad that you
take it where you want.
Brought in your definition of spiritual, and also bringing in that part of one of the core parts of any philosophical discussion, which is how philosophy sits with the reality of death, and how that fuels our life, and how that comes to be a consistent theme in this. And so I'm really glad you brought up that point too, and then that point also of nihilism as an avoidance tactic to say, well, just then nothing matters. The word definition I'd like to shift to that feels related to this is imposter syndrome, both the personal level and also the sort of imposter of saying, if we are constantly talking about and contemplating and reflecting on our death, then we're not living, in my experience, if that's all we're giving our attention to. And so there's some imposter syndrome that comes up too in life, that is letting go of being so focused on the end of life to live life. And there's also the imposter syndrome to, again, tie to psychopractology and everyone being assholes and fallibility, that seems very related to, and shame, and these things that we want to act like we don't, that we're not all experiencing on some level, even though we can't communicate the exact way. So all of that preamble to say, what are your words that you would use to describe the words of imposter syndrome? And also, however it feels relevant to you, how does imposter syndrome feel relevant to this conversation?
Good. Yes. So tying it into tying that together with the thing about death. First of all, in my line of work, there's a whole lot of imposter syndrome. I talked with that neuroscientist, biological anthropologist a couple of years ago, and I said, God, I just feel like I'm not keeping up. And he says, tell me about it. I mean, he feels like he's got imposter syndrome all the time. And here's a Harvard neuroscientist. So we're all dealing with that. That's some of what it means to be trudging through the sandstorm of possibilities as we humans do. I think of us as a FOMO species. We are fundamentally anxious. Even the opportunities out there, we are kids in a candy shop, but that's its own kind of terror, because you could be missing where the candy is. I remember when my folks were dying, they died young at 59 of different cancers, 2 years apart. But I noticed that I felt an extraordinary relief when I was hanging out with them in their last days, I felt a relief with respect to my to-do list. I mean, to-do list. I adore these people, and I was sad to see them go. You know, plenty of crying, but I knew for the first time where I belonged. There was no question but that I should be right there with them. So all the rest of my life, I was always dealing with FOMO. I mean, I'm in my 30s at this time and didn't know what I was good for and didn't know where I belonged and always felt like I was. And so this was the one time I had my to-do list down to one thing: be here. It was the obvious place to be. There was no place else to be. It turns out that that was a major motivator for Islam. Islam said you can reduce your to-do list to praying 5 times a day and a few other rules. There is extraordinary relief in constraining ourselves down to a few things we do. And that's more fundamental to my theory of what a self is. So a Moire pattern is where you get an overlap between things and some things neutralize out. And so you end up dealing with the network that comes through. Think about putting 2 filters over something and only a few things make it through the filter, okay? At the dynamic level, that's what I think a living being is. I am not something added to matter. I am a reduction in the things that the matter could do. I am a subset of what's physically possible. And when I die, the material that's in me is free to do a whole lot more things. You can think about it like, think about watch parts. If you jingle them in a bag, they can do a whole lot more configurations than if you put them in a watch. So the functionality comes out of constraining or limiting them. And so that's what the third thing is for me. It's not a third thing, it's a reduction in possibilities. I get to my to-do list by eliminating things from by adding things to my to-don't list. That is, self-discipline or deliberateness is a deliberation. So that's it's a somewhat foreign, it shouldn't be as foreign as this notion of what I am. I am a limitation on what happens such that the limitation on happens continues. Now, it doesn't continue forever, I die. So there's a whole field that deals with this that came out of Becker's work called terror management theory, where they're doing psychological research on what happens when you prime people on their deaths. And in general, what happens is they drop their imposter syndrome and they get all huffy about what their values are. It's one of the reasons why fear is such a great mobilizer for conservative values. You know, they'll interview someone on the street and ask them, what's the capital of California? And then they'll ask, how confident are they about their guest? Then they'll do it in front of a funeral home and their confidence spikes. They're more sure than they were before about their answers to questions like this. That is, priming people on death is an interesting effect. And
intention, you brought up the effect of intention. And I'm also hearing too focus and the power, the magic, the science of focus.
Right, and yeah, so, and also I should say that my approach to morality is way more like that. I used to be a love is the answer guy, and now I'm thinking, no, you look around the world and obviously there are 2 things. One is the more you love one thing, the more you hate its opposite. They're relative terms. Normativity is like that. I can't love everything. That wouldn't work. I can't even have positive regard for all outcomes. The more I like one outcome, the less I'll like its opposite. You know, if I really love my children, I'd really hate to see them die. So that's one problem with the love is the answer thing. But the other is that I'm no longer interested in programs that tell me how people should live. You look around the world and people live lots of different ways that work perfectly well. So in a free society, you don't get to tell people how they ought to live, but you still have to put a leash on the assholes, which is why I spend 250 pages trying to define them. That is, I am interested in a focus-based approach to reality, to morality, where people can do whatever they want within the confines, but you can't go over the line into asshole behavior, and we better get much clearer on what asshole behavior is, or else we'll all just be kind of policing each other by vague standards. That's the idea behind that. I want to say one trivial thing about death, which is we spend a lot of time often thinking about how we'll be remembered at our memorials. This week I've been cleaning my house because I realized that in terms of hours spent thinking about me after I'm gone, my kids cleaning up after me is actually going to be long. It's more human hours than the funeral itself. So I don't want to leave them a big mess. Um, it's kind of a trivial and yet somewhat philosophical idea about winter cleaning. I'm 64. I'm not planning to die anytime soon. I feel very healthy, but it's still something about cleaning up after yourself that's intriguing to me. And finally, just that fallibilism is settling comfortably into the unsettled state of being an imposter. That's what it is.
Pause. Say that again. Fallibilism is the uncomfortable state.
It's settling comfortably into the uncomfortable, unsettled state of being an imposter.
An acceptance of it, to go back to sort of a Buddhist philosophy of accepting it as it is, potentially, and the reality of that. Or is that, do you feel that way about it?
Yes, except I want to add another level to it. That is, I think that you got to go out a level more meta than that. Is I am settled in an unsettled life. I am very at peace with a life of straining and striving and imposter syndrome and all of the other stuff that's part of this clusterfuck. That is, I'm not sure how much that gets conveyed in current versions of Buddhism. There is a way, because I think that Buddhism mostly appeals to people who need a degree of equanimity. As you don't go to it when you're comfortable. The only time I ever was really motivated to be here now was when my past and my future looked so incredibly shitty that I had no place else to be. That was the only time in my life I actually ever really felt like, not that I should meditate, but like meditating because I was fucking trapped. I couldn't stand my past. I couldn't stand my future. So once you populate a belief system, however it formed, with people who are in that stress bunny state I was in, yeah, it's going to end up becoming much more an appeal to anti-intellectual, mindlessness, which is interesting because it borders right on Sarah Palin. You can get all the way out there to where you don't care about the coming and going of beings, and you're at peace with yourself, and thoughts, you let them come and go. That's Sarah Palin. So I'm always interested in how you got to watch out, because these things the more they get virtuous, it's like Pac-Man. At some point, they end up on the vice side. So, yeah. So there's that too.
You brought up a lot of good points there, and I appreciate too the more zoomed out perspective. And I'm gonna lovingly push back on it with hippieism of saying what I was hearing you saying was in some sense love for all of the things, and maybe that's my definition of peace and love being so similar, to say I'm at peace with the chaos. To me is how I experience that feeling of it from my bias, of loving the chaos. So it is, which again, and I'm really glad too, and I have "Be Here Now" tattooed on me, and I'm glad you brought that part up too, of coming to that because of discomfort and how much that is a catalyst for growth, and being, all of so many cliches of things about finding comfort in discomfort. And this is jogging my head back to what you were talking about with the 3 different forms. You talked about God and dogs and blogging, and that therapy of it, that healing, which, to go again to science and spirituality, is a big part of what both of those communities are striving for, from my perspective, of if they're striving towards anything.
So I think I may need to wrap this up soon, and I want to suggest.
Yes, I want to wrap up with your giving your definition of the self and of asshole from your research of it.
Okay, but first I want to hit love for a second.
Okay.
Love is a very promiscuous word, I suspect, because we need it to be. That is, I can use it to distinguish why I would lay down my life for someone, or I can use it about some hubcaps I recently bought. Really love those hubcaps. So why would we have a word as squirrely as that? That would enable me to say, to bring comfort to someone by saying, I love you, and them reading it as I'd be willing to lay down my life for you. And also I love the whole world. I love everything in the world. I love Donald Trump. Okay. I try to bring more rigor to these words, and I do have an actual definition for love. And by the way, it's the same definition I have for addiction. It's doing dedicated work to maintain something you're dependent upon. I think of love as something finite. I think the only difference between love and addiction, the only one I've ever been able to find, is that addiction is when you think it's going to turn out badly, and a love is when you think it's going to turn out well. But otherwise, they denote the same process, which is, of all the things I could do, I focus on doing things that would enable me to maintain something that I depend upon being maintained. I don't necessarily maintain it, depend on it, on it directly benefiting me, though that can be the case. You know, when they say I love you to a partner, you're often saying I love you because you're present for me, and it often becomes harder to love them when they no longer love you, that sort of thing. But anyway, doing dedicated work, constrained work of all the things you could do to maintain that which you depend upon. So if I am doing dedicated work for a partner and then they leave me, I'm quite partial to this partner, literally partial, because when they leave me, suddenly I'm not half the man I used to be. So that's got to do with the dependence.
There's a shadow hanging over me.
All that business, all that. So this relates directly to what living beings, what distinguishes life.
Thank you for bringing up that overlap too with love and addiction.
Yeah, physical, inanimate things don't have love relationships. They don't have anything like a love relationship. They endure as long as they do, and then they vanish. They stop being the things they are. My wall will decay one day. It's not in any loving relationship with me. But organisms are dependent on their environment for things. So I am dependent on, I do dedicated work to maintain access to something that I depend upon. That's a living phenomena. Only living things love.
Which then is directly connected to the self and the existence of, and
exactly. So I'm talking about
the self, to say that there has to be a self that is loving and being loved.
Right. Now check this out. Because I'm going to tie this right over so I went from love to selves to assholes. Watch this. One of the interesting challenges for all living beings, the fundamental thing we have to do is to prevent ourselves from degenerating. That's the number one thing. Everything in the world is falling apart and petering out. That's the second law of thermodynamics. And we have to hustle against it. We're running uphill against the tendency to slide to degeneration. So today I will produce 240 billion new cells to replenish cells that have decayed and died or are sloughing off in me. That's a lot of hustle to keep myself from degenerating. I've got two fundamental tasks as a self, and this would be true if I was the first organism or the simplest organism ever were. I have to take in energy and resources that I can use to regenerate myself, and I have to protect against energy and resources that would degenerate me. So I am fundamentally in this arrangement. I have to engage with the world through selective interaction. I want to take in water, I don't want to take in poison. And organisms have to do that from the beginning, because the last thing I want to do is take in the energy and resources that will degenerate me, and not take in the resources and energy that I can use to regenerate myself. Okay, now you apply that at the symbolic level. At the level of language, what do you get? You get confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is I will only take in the ideas that regenerate my mojo, and I won't take in the ideas that degenerate my mojo. And at the extreme, so most people recognize confirmation bias as a problem we have to manage. We were talking about it early on as science and others, and the human bias. Human bias is confirmation bias. It's that, don't tell me that I only want to know the likable story. I don't want to hear the likely story. An asshole is someone who treats confirmation bias as the solution to all of their problems. If it degenerates my mojo, my motivation, it's fake news. That's an asshole. That's how you fake infallibility. It's how you play God. Is you will no longer take in anything that is degenerative of your motivation, spirit, uplift, etc. So there's my definition of asshole on top of it. I went from love to selves to assholes. For what it's worth.
Thank you for going into so many different words and the different definitions of them too.
You're welcome. That's fun.
Do you have time for one final one to close it off here?
Yes, one final one. Connection
and boundaries.
Yes, in a way, I just dealt with that.
Yes.
I need to connect with the stuff.
About it.
I need to connect with the stuff that that will regenerate me, and me can include my love of humanity continuing or life continuing. So I need to connect to the things where I can contribute as well. But and boundary is not connecting with the things that degenerate us. So basically what I'm talking about is confirmation bias management. I really need my confirmation bias. I really need to close my ears to stuff that's going to discourage me. I speed read poison pen letters. I don't read those things. I don't pore over them in great detail. If someone's slagging me off, if I'm trashed by some troll, it's not like I'm going to go study it in close detail. There's a limit to how much of that stuff I'll take in. I will close my ears. I will shut people off. I will unfriend them on Facebook. I will often say, I wish you well elsewhere. That kind of thing happens a lot. I have a limited fuss budget. I can only fuss about a certain number of things. I pick where I put it, and I mostly put it into things that generate more mojo for me. At the same time, I have to watch out. So we come full circle to that thing about I want to keep an open mind, but I don't want my brains to spill out. I'm very grateful for my addictions and for my closed-mindednesses. I love them. They're provisional. I could change them, but people often make a positive thing out of open-mindedness. Fuck that. I worked hard for my fear of intimacy. I don't want to, I earned this the hard way. I think it's very careful how I like how I'm honing my powers of boundary and connection. And I think that's what we want to do. We just want to hone them. I'll make bad guesses and let in the wrong thing or keep out the wrong thing, but I do want to get better at it. So that's what I mean. A life of selective interaction.
I really like confirmation bias management that's a fun word label, phrase.
Yeah, there you go.
Making a series of life experiments here.
Exactly. Trial and error with some learning along the way.
Yeah. Thank you for experimenting with coming on this podcast and going into all these different definitions of things. There's definitely a lot here in terms of words, and I feel like we went really fast through a lot of things. So I really appreciate
have a tendency to do that. Yes, thank you.
We covered a lot of ground, and it felt.
We did.
I'm sure the overlaps and connections will make more sense later on as I go. All
right, sweet. That's good.
And more ones will come up. Thank you
so much
for coming on and sharing. I look forward to your book coming out and the research and the things you're doing continuing.
Yeah.
And I'll put all your stuff here in the description so that people listening can find you.
Sounds good. And stay in touch. Nice to talk with you.
Thank you. You too. Thank you, Jeremy, for being here. Thanks for being you. Thank you, listener, for being here. And thanks for being you.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.